The Diplomat, 31st of July 2023, Foreign Policy of India. Sri Lanka's development represents a strategic setback for China. China has made Sri Lanka debt-trapped, conquered territory, and reduced its citizens to slavery. India has stepped up its efforts to free the Sri Lankan people from slavery. A year ago, Sri Lanka was the center of attention worldwide due to its most significant economic crisis in over 70 years. It caused violent riots, serious domestic unrest, acute gasoline, food, medical shortages, and other vital issues. Under the Rajapaksa clan, whose watch, Sri Lanka's foreign debt burden had risen to nearly impossible levels, with a substantial chunk of it owed to Chinese creditors. The crisis was brought on by a combination of internal policy errors. The Rajapaksas knew Sri Lanka's economic problems but refused to ask the International Monetary Fund, IMF, for help. The problem stemmed from the government's inadequate foreign reserves, which made it difficult to pay back debt, and economic mismanagement brought on by legitimacy issues, which drove it to enact tax cuts to win over the populace. As a result, Sri Lanka is dealing with tremendous sovereign debt, hyperinflation, depreciating currency, budget and current account deficits, and everything else that could go wrong with the economy. The turmoil in Sri Lanka caused severe strategic anxiety for India's neighbor. Chinese influence on the island has grown over the past 10 years as Mahinda Rajapaksa started borrowing extensively to pay for the long civil conflict, partly financed by China's weapons. An Indian peacekeeping mission in the late 1980s strained relationships between New Delhi and Colombo. After the war, India cast several votes at the UN Human Rights Council, putting Sri Lanka under pressure to answer for its deeds and encourage peace with the island's Tamil minority. Mahinda Rajapaksa's tendency for vanity and pet projects allowed China to erode India's area of influence over Sri Lanka. The 2017 99-year lease of the strategically positioned Hambantota port to the Chinese state-owned China Merchants Port Holding Company for $1.1 billion perfectly illustrates the Rajapaksa era's fixation with infrastructure projects. Sri Lanka obtained funds from Chinese banks to improve the port and reduce the shipping load on the nation's major port in Colombo. Only the new port was unable to bring in the essential money. The Rajapaksa administration eventually crumbled under the weight of its $25 billion debt load to private lenders and its financial obligations to Beijing. Indian strategists feared that Colombo would wind up at the mercy of aggressive Chinese creditors as the country descended into economic chaos. The August landing of a Chinese surveillance ship at the port of Sri Lanka had added to China's string of pearls a few years earlier, only confirming these suspicions. It appeared that Beijing had successfully encroached on Sri Lanka's traditional bastion of Indian influence. 1 year later, however, New Delhi emerged victorious from what initially seemed to be a strategic victory for Xi Jinping and his efforts to increase Chinese influence in the Indian Ocean. The timing was crucial. Despite tensions in the relationship while Mahinda Rajapaksa was in power, India chose to focus on Sri Lanka's level of investment to show the country's beleaguered government that it had always been a friend and a dependable development partner rather than worrying about issues it could not control on its own. Due to Beijing's lack of response to Sri Lanka's demands for assistance throughout the crisis, India has benefited from the perception among the Sri Lankan public that China is pursuing a strategic advantage. Some claim that China is using Sri Lanka's economic woes by waiting for the ideal moment to engage in more debt-to-equity swaps, giving Beijing a more significant stake in premium real estate. 2 weeks before Gotabaya Rajapaksa was forced to escape Sri Lanka in July 2022, Foreign Secretary Vinay Quatra made an unexpected trip to Colombo for a series of meetings with government officials. This act served as more proof of New Delhi's immaculate timing. India concentrated its attention on Sri Lanka's economy, which threatened to bring an economic catastrophe and a humanitarian crisis. At the same time, China's strategic location was a concern. India backed up its visit with extra financial support, and there have been talks about expanding its credit facility to allow for the purchase of necessities like food, fuel, and medical supplies. Bilateral connections have changed due to India's humanitarian and foreign policy choices throughout the past year. Early on, India moved quickly to make a flurry of financial commitments and promises of prompt aid. It provided $4 billion in help between January and July 2022 and sent a warship with medical supplies to support Sri Lanka's 20 million citizens. This year, Colombo has received a flurry of financial help. The two countries' central banks have supported the idea, arguing that rupee settlements would reduce exchange rates and transaction costs and simplify the provision of trade credits. In March, India explored the possibility of using the Indian rupee for economic transactions that would help build a stronger trade relationship. India's $1 billion credit line was extended by Sri Lanka in May for an additional year, giving the island nation the freedom to pay for necessary imports even though its cash flow and foreign exchange reserves remain constrained. Requests for debt treatment are discussed and handled by an official creditor committee, which India co-chairs and comprises aid-giving nations like France and Japan. Additionally, India was the first nation to write a letter endorsing debt restructuring when Sri Lanka requested assistance from the IMF. Last, the important Trincomalee and Colombo ports in Sri Lanka could be reached via a land bridge that Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Sri Lankan President Ranil Wickremesinghe recently signed. There was also talk of a prospective gas pipeline running from southern India to northern Sri Lanka. India's economic diplomacy about Sri Lanka has put China on the defensive. Although it has also agreed to restructure its debt and postpone interest payments to Chinese banks, some changes were made due to international pressure from the United States and Japan. The flurry of economic agreements has, at the very least, handed India a PR triumph over its adversary while also improving India's reputation and prestige in Sri Lanka. India will probably be able to acquire longer-term strategic investments that further diminish China's influence as it gains greater confidence from Colombo by enhancing its reputation as a dependable development partner. The security interests and growth of the two countries are intertwined, as Modi highlighted after meeting with Wickremesinghe after their initial meeting earlier this month. Later on, India's lingering security concerns should be reduced thanks to the improved development ties.